bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone. Gravediggers.
Hey folks, we're back.
It's Erin from Seoul.
And it's Amar in Toronto. A very windy Toronto, by the way. I don't know if you can hear this, but we're having a storm here, so it's quite loud.
In Seoul, it's just a regular sunny Monday right now.
We haven't had the sun in a while here. It's just been cloudy and stormy.
Yeah, I think it's going to be like that until June, so enjoy it, Amar.
Yeah, I'll try to.
Speaking of storm clouds and rain and snow and the cold, we have a fun episode for you today.
Yeah, I thought it was one of the more darkly lighter ones.
Yeah, that kind of describes our pod, darkly light or lightly dark.
Yeah, it's just be our tagline.
So we've got another sort of ethical dilemma type episode, but not really, because I think the ethics here are pretty clear. That's just my opinion, but we'll try our best to lay it out for all of you. Kind of one of those episodes where we use one case to talk about a broader problem, which is something that we do a lot on the pod. So if you've been listening for a while, you'll know exactly what we mean.
Yeah.
On May 13th, 2006, British mountaineer David Sharp set out on a solitary expedition to the summit of Mount Everest. Though an experienced hobbyist climber, David never made it back down the mountain and is thought to have died on the 15th of May, 2006, at age 34. Whether he reached the peak is unknown. It's probably no surprise to most of us that ascending and descending Mount Everest is extraordinarily dangerous. People die nearly every year climbing the mountain, bringing the total recorded death count to over 300 people. But David Sharp's death, in particular, stirred controversy as several climbing expeditions passed him and did not, or were unable to, help him. In this episode, we're going to discuss the industry that has risen around climbing Mount Everest, the ethical responsibility to help those in need, and how, even on the world's tallest mountain, capitalism encourages us to leave our brothers and sisters behind. So let's begin with an overview of the Everest industry, the extreme tourism business that has risen around the snowy Leviathan. We're certainly not the first to explore this topic. My Favorite Murder and Last Week Tonight with John Oliver have both done episodes on it, so we'll be sure to include those in our source list as we found them informative.
Yeah, I also read a book in middle school, I believe, that was called Climbing Everest, and it was like some kid who saves up money to go to climb Everest, which I think is weird and strange, but who am I to judge what kids do?
Did you, as a young Bahraini child, feel inspired, Amr?
Okay, look, you're talking to a kid who never saw snow until he came to Canada, so the idea that this kid is struggling with climbing up a mountain and snow and all that, it might as well have been Lord of the Rings to me in terms of how empathetic I felt.
So, as the tallest peak above sea level at 8,848 meters or 29,029 feet, Mount Everest has understandably become an ambition for mountaineers and adventure seekers worldwide. Several British expeditions attempted to summit the mountain in the 1920s to the 1940s, but these were not successful. It wasn't until 1953 that Nepali Tenzing Norgay and New Zealander Edmund Hillary reached the apex. Of course, it's possible that some Nepali people reached the summit at some earlier point. Still, the 1953 expedition is widely considered the first documented ascension to the top of Everest. For several decades following the Tenzing Hillary summit, Mount Everest was still an expedition restricted to only the most experienced climbers. Many of these are Nepalese Sherpas, a Tibetan ethnic group indigenous to the Himalayas. Between 1953 and 1988, there were a total of 260 ascents.
Yeah, apparently, from what I've read, the Sherpa's major economy today is basically just acting as expedition guides for would-be rich climbers. And I only think it's interesting only because I wonder what their local economy was like before this craze, if you will, this climbing craze.
Yeah, I assume the economy was probably just much more localized, not as much a global center.
Yeah, much less dollars flowing through. I can definitely imagine that.
Yeah, but definitely in the past few decades, Mount Everest has become such a popular climbing destination that the mountain has even faced problems from overcrowding. Commercial expeditions took off in the 1990s, and the number of climbers has sharply risen since then. Between 1988 and 2018, there were a total of 8,899 ascents.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of claims of overcrowding, lots of plastic trash left behind, things of that nature. And I don't mean to sound preachy, but it does sound depressing when tourism sort of sucks the life out of an otherwise beautiful vista or area.
Yeah, it's literally been called the world's tallest toilet and things because there is actually so much human excrement on the mountain, which is slowly sliding down, that it's dangerous for the Nepalese and Tibetan people who live at the bottom.
Oh, that's fucking gross. I didn't even think about the fact that, like, there's no running water up there until just now, and that's just disgusting.
And it's also tourists, climbers, mountaineers going to the mountain and literally leaving shit behind for the locals to deal with.
Well, more like shitting on the locals, like from a sort of up to down perspective. And then, they just leave afterwards because they don't have to deal with the waste and all that.
Yeah, exactly. So, here are some things you might not know about climbing Mount Everest. It's actually not one of the most technically challenging mountains to climb, though that doesn't mean it isn't dangerous. Writing for the Washington Post, Grayson Schaefer explains that Everest is what alpinists call a walk-up, or a slow, plodding ascent. In other words, you have to be physically fit enough to hike up Everest, but it doesn't require intricate rock climbing skills, like scaling the side of a cliff.
Yeah, apparently the second highest peak in the Himalayas and across from Everest is much, much more difficult insofar as it requires actual mountaineering, like climbing up cliffs and so on.
Still, climbers can die from things like avalanches, falls, xeric or glacial ice collapses, exposure, frostbite, pulmonary and cerebral edema, dysentery, and stroke. There are actually two established routes up Mount Everest. The first is the Southwest Ridge from Nepal, and the second is the North Col route from Tibet. Most commercial expeditions take the Southwest Ridge route from Nepal, partially because the climb is slightly more manageable, but more so because the Nepalese government is much laxer in issuing climbing permits than the Chinese government. Unlike China, Nepal has no limits on the numbers of permits it issues. This year, Everest hasn't seen commercial tourism, but this has been due to COVID-19 rather than a change in the permit laws specifically.
Which just made me think of the Sherpas right now. I wonder how they're holding up.
Yeah. Nepal requires an $11,000 fee and a doctor's note saying that you're physically fit in order to get that visa. Now, it was more complicated than that to get my work visa for Korea. It wasn't nearly as expensive, but I had to jump through hoops and get several doctor's notes, including a required checkup in Korea, in order to get my visa.
Wait, so you're paying $11,000 to the Nepalese government just for the visa, and then you have additional travel costs and stuff?
Yes.
That's a lot of money. I don't think I'd justify being able to spend that.
Right, and I think it is supposed to set somewhat of a bar to keep unserious climbers out. Like, you and I can't just decide, oh, what are we going to do this summer? Let's try to climb Mount Everest. Like, you have to be literally invested in it. But still, it means any person with $11,000 to spare, a doctor's note, more money for equipment and things, and who's reasonably physically fit might try to do this.
Yeah.
Inexperienced climbers can then climb, or at least attempt to climb, Everest, putting themselves and others at risk. Unsurprisingly, in a global capitalist world, The Everest industry has expanded to include luxury trips that cost over $100,000, with amenities like heated tents, a base camp nightclub, a whiskey tasting yurt, and, of course, Sherpa guides. John, The Problem is Capitalism, but I won't just say that, Oliver, has detailed a segment on this for interested listeners. Sherpas bear the brunt of the risk in Everest tourism, as they're the people who prepare things like ladders for crossing over crevasses. Often, they even carry other people's gear up the mountain. Everest Sherpa is actually one of the deadliest occupations on Earth.
Yeah, we should have a flag, like a thin blue line, but it's like a thin Sherpa line to represent, deadliest occupations, actual deadliest occupations.
Yeah, because the more times you go up and down that dangerous mountain over those ice falls, the more risky it is for you, the more likely it is the ice could collapse and you would die.
Yeah, you're multiplying the probability of accidents every time you go up and down.
Right, so the Sherpas are some of the most skilled climbers that there are. The guides, that's their job. But these are accidents, like natural accidents. A Sherpa told David Scott of HBO's Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel that none of the tourists he sees could make it to the top of Everest without their help.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of how Burning Man went from this sort of do-it-yourself festival that sort of celebrates self-sufficiency into this weird orgy of Silicon Valley tech bros who basically spend piles of cash to include very, very luxurious comforts in the middle of the desert just to, status symbols and all that.
In 2019, Everest had its most climbers ever, and several videos showed alpinists huddled in a line near the top of the mountain, waiting for their chance to reach the summit. This bottlenecking is profoundly hazardous, as the area near the top of Everest is known as the death zone. From Wikipedia, quote, "The death zone is a mountaineering term for altitudes above a certain point, around 8,000 meters or 26,000 feet, or less than 356 millibars, or 5.16 psi of atmospheric pressure, where the oxygen pressure level is not sufficient to sustain human life," end quote. In other words, the human body cannot acclimatize at this altitude because we use oxygen faster than can be replenished, and staying in the death zone for too long will result in a person's deterioration and death.
Yeah, I mean, there are variations in people's adaptability to low oxygen conditions. For example, mountain-based populations like Andean tribes and the Sherpas have exhibited much higher tolerance for low-pressure environments in general. But to be clear, when we say the death zone on Everest, we mean an area that is fatal for everyone. If you stay there too long, you will die, and no amount of aerobic yoga will help you with that.
Yeah, people go to Everest, usually several weeks before they intend to climb, like go to the base of the mountain.
Yeah, and acclimate their lungs.
Yeah, but no one can acclimate to this. Not the Sherpas, not anyone. Part of the overcrowding problem at Everest is due to weather conditions. Each year, there are only about 10 days in May when it's possible to make the ascent. David Sharp died during this window, the 15th of May. Many climbers also try to make their climbing situation unique, such as being the first married couple to climb, or some moronic thing like that. If you've ever seen Hey Arnold, to me it sounds like that episode where they try all these weird things to break a world record and they end up exploding a giant pizza puff all over the city.
I haven't seen Hey Arnold, but I will pretend I know this popular culture reference.
Yeah, maybe that was a very American child experience.
Is that a cartoon? The cartoon with the rabbit and all the other animals, or?
No, they're people, and It's on Nickelodeon. It's about this kid who lives in a boarding house that his grandparents run.
Ah. Oh yeah, I just Googled that. Yeah, I've seen this character around, but I don't think I've ever watched one of the shows.
Yeah, he's got a head shaped like a football.
Yeah, and like the spiky hair, yeah.
So some mountaineers will try to make their experience more unique, more challenging, more authentic, who knows. But one way that they do this is climbing without using supplementary oxygen. Some people appear to think there are more bragging rights if you choose to climb without using oxygen. To me, personally, such people sound absolutely insufferable. They're like people who brag about giving birth without having epidurals. Like, Sure, I mean, that's your choice, but you were in more pain than most physicians consider medically necessary. I don't understand what you want from me for telling me that.
I think that's like a symptom of a larger situation I see with people where like they just want to outdo other people in a weird way. Like I don't know if you've had this experience, but sometimes like you'll have like a classmate and you're like, yeah, I stayed up all night working on this assignment. You just like mentioned that offhand, and they're like, oh yeah, well I stayed up all week working on this assignment. Trying to outdo other people in very weird and otherwise inane ways.
I think we do find this weird value in torturing ourselves. Like, I did this climb without oxygen. I had a baby without having any painkillers, these things. Like, again, that is your choice, I suppose, but I don't get, what do you want from me? How am I supposed to respond to that?
Here's a cookie.
Right. So again, the oxygen levels at the death zone at Everest Peak are not high enough to sustain human life. You are up there on borrowed time.
Yeah, and see, I get that when it comes to things like hunting, like maybe like I'd go around and hunt wild game using a bow and arrow or like a bolt action rifle instead of like, high-powered assault rifle from a helicopter. But like not using supplemental oxygen or not using an epidural, like there's absolutely no point to that. You're doing a task and there are equipment to help with that task that would otherwise severely risk your life. So why? I don't understand. I think it's weirdly against the sort of self-preservation instinct that people should have.
There are points of authenticity that I think I might roll my eyes, but like, that's fine. Like people who like to listen to vinyl records more than MP3s and insist they're way better. Like they are in a way, but I find someone who says like, oh, I won't listen to music on my phone. Like, okay, don't you get bored?
Yeah.
Like, I understand too in food being like, oh, this za'atar comes straight from Palestine. Like, that's the kind of stuff I want. But no one's put at risk from that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, it is a qualitative difference, I think, like, with things that are like, okay, fine, like, you want to listen to your vinyls, that's fine. You want to have, like, authentic food, that's fine. But, like, in this case, you're unnecessarily risking your life for no other reason than to boast that you did something that other people did, but, like, marginally harder intentionally. I think it's normal to boast about climbing Everest. Like, if you do that, good for you. Like, respect, man. I don't think it's as hard as other things because of all the sort of like how streamlined it's become. But like, okay, fair enough. You did something. Like, you camped in a wild area, whatever. Nice story. But like saying that and then being like, oh yeah, and I did it without oxygen. Like, okay, you want a pat on the back? You want a medal? I don't understand.
The only other people who care are like the 9,000 other people who have climbed Everest. That's it.
Probably, yeah.
In a planet of 9 billion people.
That's like less than 0.1%.
I do see the appeal though, because climbing Everest is such a literal peak. Like, you start at the bottom, you reach the top. Well, you don't actually start at sea level, you start at base camp, but you get my point. You start at the base of the mountain and you reach the top.
Yeah.
Whereas other human accomplishments, like I pulled myself out of poverty, are much more subjective, but in a way, I think even more difficult.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, it's a manifest journey that you go up a mountain, which is like most stories can be reduced to that.
Right. There is a literal path set out for you.
Yeah.
So let's get into David Sharp's death specifically. Sharp wasn't an inexperienced climber, but he did make some fatal mistakes on his final Everest journey, such as deciding to ascend without supplemental oxygen. In 2002, Sharp had summited Cho Oyu, a nearby mountain in the Himalayas, but someone else on that expedition died from falling into a crevasse. Again, why people choose hobbies where they are likely to die or witness death is entirely beyond me. What's worse is that people pay thousands upon thousands of dollars for these experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I personally get the urge to defy death in some way or another, in the sense that I feel that people have this desire to live on an exhilarating edge, and the rush that provides. But I think there's a smart way to do it, and I think there's an economically sensible way to do it. And I personally wouldn't be spending like thousands of dollars to go on like a whiskey tasting yurt in base camp just to pretend I'm defying nature. The other thing that I don't understand, and this is just me, so it's a subjective thing, I don't understand the obsession with winter-based activities. I get camping in like a forest or whatever, or going through the jungle or camping in a desert, but anything that involves temperatures below, say, 10 degrees, I don't understand. It's pointless.
I like skiing, and I did skiing all through like childhood, teenage years. But part of skiing, at least for our family, was not being cold. Having hand warmers, we always wore helmets. We took safety very seriously. Helmets, goggles, gloves, all of those things. Again, there are people, for whatever reason, who will be like, oh yeah, I did that ski trip and I didn't wear a helmet and I didn't have any gloves and it was cold. Why? Why would you do that? Why would you brag about being unprepared?
Yeah, I don't understand that at all.
So David Sharp attempted to summit Everest in 2003 and 2004, but both times had to turn back due to frostbite. From Wikipedia, quote, French climber Dauberide said Sharp disagreed with him that it was wrong to climb alone and to attempt summiting without using supplementary oxygen. This is confirmed by Sharp's emails to other climbers in which he stated he did not believe in using extra oxygen, end quote.
The way he says that is like, yeah, oxygen, I don't believe in that, you see.
Yeah, oxygen is not something that you believe in. You need oxygen to survive, whether you like it or not. Maybe Wikipedia is mischaracterizing David's attitude, and I really don't want to speak ill of the dead, but it's worth pointing out just how ridiculous it is to condescend oxygen.
On that same note, you could just say, I don't believe in gravity and just float to the peak of Everest if you really insist. But like, also this reminds me of like weird, rich new age people who dismiss medicine and science in favor of like snake oil treatments. Like the case I'm thinking of is Steve Jobs, who got a very treatable form of pancreatic cancer. But then initially his decision was to like detox and drink kombucha and like weird new age treatments instead of like the chemo that would have treated him that the doctors were recommending. And then when that failed and his tumor became a lot more aggressive, he used his money to get a private transplant anyways, just to prolong his life by a few years, which I think is just irresponsible and insane.
Sharp booked his 2006 climb through Kathmandu-based commercial adventure company Asian Trekking and only reserved the bare bones package. He did not have a Sherpa guide or a group as he planned to climb alone, a hazardous arrangement even for experienced hikers on so-called easy trails. Seriously, you should never, ever hike alone. Ever.
Yeah, I agree with that, definitely.
Sharp didn't even bring a radio to use if he needed help. From Wikipedia, quote, Sharp was climbing alone and had intended to reach the summit without using supplementary oxygen, which is considered to be extremely risky even for very strong, acclimatized mountain climbers or Sherpas, end quote. Now, I would venture to say if a Sherpa wouldn't do it, you probably shouldn't do it, for sure.
Yeah, they live there, so they would know.
Sharp set out on the 13th of May, 2006, with a limited supply of oxygen, which he intended to use only in an emergency. He was later found with only one used bottle of supplementary oxygen. Sharp is thought to have either reached the summit of Mount Everest or turned back very close to it late in the day on May 14th, 2006. Due to potential problems like equipment issues, exhaustion, and lack of oxygen, Sharp decided to seek shelter rather than descend to the camp. He tried to shelter in Green Boots Cave, named after an unidentified corpse of someone else who died there wearing bright green hiking boots. Green Boots Cave is around 26,000 feet high, so right at the edge of that death zone.
I don't mean to sound grim, but if you're aborting your mission to go up Everest, and instead of making it to base camp or to shelter, you decide to shelter in a specific cave known for someone dying there, it's a very grim sign. It's a very sort of ominous sign.
Yeah, I definitely agree. On the 13th and 14th of May, other climbers passed David Sharp and he waved them on. You know, they had no reason to be concerned. He was up, he was walking. These other climbers included a Hymex expedition, which is another travel company, and a group of Turkish hikers. On their way back down the morning of the 15th, the Turkish hikers spotted Sharp and realized he was in serious trouble. Sharp had no oxygen left, his limbs were frozen, and he had frostbite. Though the Turks were trying to get one of their own climbers down who was experiencing medical problems, some of them stayed with Sharp to give him something to drink, clean out the ice in his mask, and give him as much supplemental oxygen as they could. They also radioed down about Sharp. The Turks left when they were running low on supplemental oxygen and thought they could no longer descend themselves if they stayed with Sharp.
Yeah, see, I understand that because they did the best they could and offered as much help. But at this point, if they stayed, they'd all have died. So, I mean, they radioed for backup and left, which is exactly something I would have done. So in this case, I completely support their ethical choices.
Yeah, they did what they could, and when they realized everyone could be at risk if they stayed any longer, they sadly had to leave.
Yeah.
More controversial, however, is a second HIMEX team who encountered David Sharp as he was dying. So this expedition had actually split into two teams, the first of which, Lebanese mountaineer Maxim Shaya and Sherpa Dorji, did not see Sharp during their ascent as it was dark, but noticed him on the way down. Shaya and Dorji attempted to help David Sharp by giving him supplemental oxygen and radioing down to their base camp contact. After staying with him for some time, they ran into the same problem as the Turks. They were running out of supplemental oxygen, and Sharp was too exhausted and frostbitten to bring down the mountain safely. They had to move on or risk meeting the same fate.
I just keep reading supplemental oxygen and I just keep thinking, like, imagine going up without your own supplemental oxygen and then having other people donate theirs, which is like heroic and kind and, important. But like, how narcissistic is it? Basically, your own arrogance dragging people down like that.
Yeah, the whole thing is really sad, but I agree. It does put other people in danger.
Yeah.
The second team, which included climbing guide Mark Woodward, Discovery Network cameraman Mark Waitu, New Zealand double amputee Mark Inglis, and several Sherpas, encountered Sharp earlier than the other teams mentioned during their ascent. Team leader Woodward saw that Sharp was breathing, but had severe frostbite and was unresponsive to a headlamp shined in his eyes. Woodward radioed base camp but received no reply. He believed that Sharp could not be saved and directed the group to move on.
Wait, so what was justification for Sharp being beyond saving? Because if this group came across Sharp before the other two groups, and the other two groups claimed that they saw him like walking around initially, and then there was still a chance to help him, surely the Woodward group could have done a lot more, including sending someone back to camp to bring back help. I'm very confused in the timeline here.
The first two groups did not see him walking around. In the first couple days, people saw him walking around, walking up the mountain.
Oh, okay, that makes a lot more sense. Okay.
So these groups, the Turkish expedition and the first kind of mini team with Lebanese climber Shaya and Dorji, they saw him on their way back down.
But they saw him after the Woodward group.
Yes.
Okay.
So the Woodward group actually saw him first because they saw him on the way up, but they didn't really stop to help him. They stopped, looked at him. Woodward said he was not in good condition, and they continued climbing up the mountain.
Right, okay. That makes a lot more sense. Okay.
And why it has received more criticism is because in the case of the Turkish climbers and of Shaya and Dorji, they were coming back down the mountain. So they stopped, they both tried to help, they couldn't, and they continued going down the mountain. But this other team could have turned back, could have done something more to try to get him help, but they continued going up the mountain.
Yeah, I guess their priority was to do the summit instead of, save this guy's life.
Exactly. So this met really harsh criticism in the media once it came out that they had encountered the struggling Sharp earlier than the other expeditions, but had seemingly done the least to help him. Notably, Sir Edmund Hillary, the first to ascend Mount Everest in 1953, said that leaving other climbers to die is unacceptable. Quote, "I think the whole attitude towards climbing Mount Everest has become rather horrifying. The people just want to get to the top. It was wrong if there was a man suffering altitude problems and was huddled under a rock just to lift your hat, say good morning, and pass on by. They don't give a damn for anybody else who may be in distress, and it doesn't impress me at all that they leave someone lying under a rock to die. I think that their priority was to get to the top, and the welfare of a member of another expedition was very secondary." End quote. Sharp is believed to have died on the mountain from hypothermia or cerebral edema later that day. His body remains on Mount Everest, though it has been moved out of sight of the trail. Sharp's death isn't the only time a similar incident has occurred. In a 2012 article for The Guardian, John Henley quotes testimony from a climber named Leanna Shuttleworth. Quote, "There were quite a few bodies attached to the fixed lines, and we had to walk around them," Shuttleworth said later. There were also a couple who were still alive. Shuttleworth describes coming across one man who she assumed had perished. "As we passed, he raised his arm and looked at us," she said. "He didn't know anyone was there. He was almost dead. He was dead when we came back down." Their Sherpa did manage to help one of the people they found who was still alive. End quote. Okay, first of all, how could anyone just watch a dying man raise his arm for help and walk right past them? That is unbelievable to me. Absolutely sociopathic. To admit that to the media also shows that you're fucking unbalanced.
Yeah, I'm struggling to visualize how it went. Like, imagine just going by and like, sorry, mate, just passing by, no worries, just scooting over here, mind the hand as I go off. Cheers, pal. Which is like grim. And imagine also how overwhelmed Everest has become with tourists, that you're basically just attached to a line passing by corpses who couldn't make it up or down. Like, at this point, you might as well just install an escalator there, a conveyor belt, and just sell tickets to that.
Oh, totally. And I also think Leanna may have said this to exaggerate the horrors of climbing Mount Everest. Like, other people couldn't even make it up the mountain. We had to pass their dead and dying bodies, and it was so sad. But I reached the summit. Like, again, fucking sociopathic.
Oh, yeah.
Henley also points out that in instances where people have stepped in to help, like the Sherpa aiding someone who was found alive, many of those people survived. So, for example, only a week after the death of David Sharp in 2006, a team led by American mountaineer Don Mazer gave up on their attempt at reaching the summit to help a distressed and abandoned climber named Lincoln Hall, and he survived. The same weekend, Leanna Shuttleworth and her dad reached the peak. An Israeli climber named Nadav Ben Yehuda carried another climber on his back for 8 hours to save his life. That's genuinely incredible.
I hate to be one of those people that says, like, faith in humanity restored, but, like, that is incredibly heroic.
And it's worth pointing out, when people are helped, they have survived. But when trips cost thousands upon thousands of dollars, hikers don't want to abandon their goal of reaching the world's zenith to help someone in need. They're not there to be decent people. They're there to step foot on the summit of Mount Everest and then to tell people about it for the rest of their lives. Capitalism has enabled wealthy people without proper experience to pay for the adventure and bragging rights of climbing Mount Everest while Sherpas carry their stuff. What kind of people do you think are going to take them up on that offer? Humble, empathetic people who have dedicated their lives to serving others?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of when I went to the Sahara when I was in Morocco, where you pay a Berber expedition group to guide you into the camp and you stay overnight in the desert. But it's nowhere near as dangerous because you're still fairly close to town, all things considered. And they don't like go right in the middle of the Sahara. The guides also carry a lot of stuff and, the camels and so on. So you have a lot of supplies and food and the like. And I treated them as much respect as I can because, frankly, we were their guests. But I keep thinking about it. I'm like, I can totally understand if they just told us to just fuck off. If something were to happen, town could have sent a car or something for like a couple of hours and they would have found us. So it wasn't like smack in the middle of the Sahara.
I have been backpacking before for like 10 days at one time. And again, we had a radio, we had a satellite phone, we were in a big group. We frequently came across other big groups. Of course, there are dangers, like you could fall off the side of a mountain if you weren't being careful, but everyone had hiking poles and things. Like, it wasn't a huge concern that would happen. And we took all these precautions, of course, to keep ourselves safe, but also because you don't want to put other people at risk coming to get you.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I keep thinking about Sharp, in the sense that Okay, the group that saw him first, that says a lot that they were more focused on making the ascent than helping him because they saw him first. And if any of them had the highest probability of saving him, it would have been them. But on the other hand, the fact that Sharp went without supplemental oxygen basically is kind of like if you're going like whitewater rafting or something and you refuse to wear a life vest and then you fall over and someone tries to jump and save you and you both die. There's still some individual responsibility to making sure that, in case something happens, you are prepared enough that if someone were to risk their lives to help you, they wouldn't be excessively risking their lives, if that makes sense.
Right. And to break it down to a really easy example to understand, we wear seatbelts in automobiles to protect ourselves, but also to protect other people in the car, because if you are in an accident and your body flies into someone else and crushes them, they could die.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I totally understand that several hikers who stopped to help David Sharp had to move on because they couldn't get him to move and they were running out of oxygen. In those cases, I don't think they really had a choice. Staying with Sharp any longer would have further jeopardized their own lives, and his chances of survival seemed slim. But those people like Leanna Shuttleworth who see people in distress reaching out for help and just move on, utter monsters. And in my opinion, the evil of capitalism incarnate. I see you suffering, but helping you would interfere with this experience that I have decided is more important. So I will literally let you die rather than abandon a goal I feel that I've earned.
Yeah, it's grim. I feel bad for Sharp's family. I hope his loved ones are, my condolences to them and so on. But please, if you're traveling somewhere, please take the right precautions. Please be safe. Please follow the necessary rules and so on.
Sharp's mother has said she understands that the other climbers couldn't help him without possibly also killing themselves. So I feel terrible for his family.
Yeah.
I don't want to say anything bad about him. I don't think he's a bad person, but I think he did something really irresponsible. And I also think the Everest tourism industry is partially to blame as well. This whole thing of capitalism where it's I just want to get to the top.
Well, it's like selling experiences. It's like if you pay some amount, it's a commodification of experiences, right? It's not just Everest, but you pay something and then because it's become a commodity where you exchange money for it, you no longer think, oh yeah, I'm a person, this is a person, and I want to help them. You're I paid for this and I want to get the thing I paid for. In this case, climbing Everest. So for Leanna Shuttleworth, she's up the mountain and she sees these dying people around her or whatever. But because in her head, she's I paid for this. I imagine on some latent level, the capital involved has so dehumanized the experience that all you can think of is I want to get the product that I paid for.
Right. And also this idea of I've gotten this far. I'm not going to help this person and turn back.
Yeah.
Okay. But I know this is hard to hear. You getting to the top of Mount Everest doesn't matter. This person surviving matters.
Well, frankly, if I was in a party and I met someone and they said something like, oh yeah, I tried to summit Everest, but then we had to stop to rescue someone, I'd be a lot more impressed than, oh, I climbed Everest,
Oh yeah, Don Mazer, who helped to save Lincoln Hall, who survived, and Nadav Ben Yehuda, who carried that guy on his back for 8 hours. I'd be like, wow, that impresses me. But knowing what I know now, if someone was like, oh yeah, I climbed Mount Everest, I'd be like, cool, so you're rich? Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, pretty much.
So hopefully we've given you a fun start to your Tuesday.
Yeah, happy Tuesday, everyone. Rise and shine wherever you may be.
If you like our podcast and you want to support financially, you can find us at patreon.com/dascriminal. And you will find that you will be extra rewarded for those contributions. So for instance, we should have a new mini episode coming out this week. In our mini episodes, we just talk about current events, books we've read, things like that. It's more of a chat than a true crime episode. So if that interests you, please head over there.
Yeah, you can build parasocial relationships with us. It's great. It's very healthy.
You can also find us on Instagram at dascriminalpod. We post photos, maps, little announcements, those sorts of things. Please rate, review, subscribe, tell your friends. every person you tell, if they tell someone and they tell someone and they tell someone, that's how
We all get
the
arrested
podcast
for
grows.
being in a Ponzi scheme. Well, that too.
And send us your case suggestions. We love it when you guys suggest cases to us.
Yeah, please do.
It's been nice seeing you guys for another week.
Yeah, bye everyone. Take care.
Thanks for listening. Bye.